Hi friends, today we're going to be talking about James Madison and the War of 1812. So Thomas Jefferson follows the precedent established by Washington and steps down after his second term. When he does that, he endorses his buddy James Madison, then Secretary of State during Jefferson's presidency. Madison, as you'll recall, was referred to as the father of the Constitution for his role in the Constitutional Convention. He was a brilliant thinker, and Madison worked hand in hand with Jefferson in establishing the Democratic-Republican Party. With Jefferson's endorsement, he was able to beat other Democratic-Republican candidates, as well as Charles Pinckney, who ran as the Federalist candidate for president. And though the Federalists did lose the presidency, they did manage to gain more seats in Congress, mainly because of the widespread unhappiness over Jefferson's Embargo Act. So, not surprising, the problems that Jefferson faced during his second term did not disappear with the election of a new president. Madison sought to alleviate these economic problems while maintaining neutrality during his presidency. And two of the biggest ways he did this was by approving these two pieces of legislation. So the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 said that the United States could trade with all nations except those that are belligerent, so basically Britain and France. In 1810, as this problem continues to persist and American ships continue to be seized and American industry is suffering, the United States gets a little bit more desperate. And they say, okay, they establish a bill. Nathaniel Macon, a member of Congress, introduces a bill that restores U.S. trade with Britain and France. Okay, so all right, fine, you continue to take our ships, but our economy is hurting so badly by the fact that we're no longer involved in French and British markets, so we're going to go ahead and jump back in. But we do have this stipulation. Macon's Bill number 2 stipulated that if either Britain or France formally agreed to respect U.S. neutrality, then the U.S. would stop trading with that nation's foe, as a sign of goodwill. But remember, that sign of goodwill is also kind of the opposite of neutrality. So Napoleon hears this, and he announces plans to revoke France's policy of interfering with U.S. trade. Madison, taking Napoleon at his word, then enacts Macon's Bill number 2 by embargoing trade with Britain in 1811. However, when French ships continue to seize American merchant ships, Madison realizes that he has been duped by Napoleon. All right. Remember, when we talk about war in this class, we tend to talk about long-term and short-term causes as well as effects. Sometimes we talk about turning points, but we're not going to really discuss that in this war today. From the U.S.'s perspective, pressures leading to the war came from two directions. The first of which was the lack of respect of the U.S.'s declarations of neutrality, and the second was the involvement of the British on the western frontier. So let's delve a little bit into that. As a trading nation, the United States depended upon the free flow of trade across the Atlantic. Yet the belligerent nations of France and Britain had no intention of respecting U.S. neutrality. So as long as their war continued, France and Britain were going to continue to seize U.S. ships. And even though both nations violate this neutrality, the U.S. remembers that Britain had been their adversary not too long ago during the Revolution, and while France had come to their aid. Also, Democratic Republicans applauded the French's overthrow of their monarchy and their own revolution. And moreover, even though both nations seized U.S. ships, only the British impressed American sailors into their navy. In terms of the frontier, another strike against the British was their presence in land that Americans living on the frontier wished to possess. Americans continued to push out into lands inhabited by native people, causing an increase in conflict. Now, this type of scenarios can sometimes be represented as Americans pushed further west and they faced increasing conflict. But it's important to remember that this conflict was caused by Americans' desire to possess more land at the expense of those already living there. And certainly any violent conflict leaves all hands bloody, but it's necessary to recognize the history of people that are frequently overlooked. So we're going to talk about Tecumseh and his rebellion, basically, or his efforts to try to keep Americans from pushing further west. In order to try to defend his land, Tecumseh, who is Shawnee, and his brother, Tenskwatawa, who is also known as Prophet, and what a surprise, is a religious leader, attempted to unite the tribes east of the Mississippi River. His brother experienced a vision calling on his people to end their dependence on white traders and return to their native ways. So white settlers were very suspicious of Tecumseh and persuaded the governor of Indiana Territory, General William Henry Harrison, to take action. And also most settlers blamed the British for instigating this rebellion, mainly because they were supplying weapons to the native people. In the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, Harrison ends up destroying the Shawnee headquarters and puts an end to Tecumseh's effort to unite the tribe. Jumping ahead a little bit, just so we can round this story off, Tecumseh later joins the British in the War of 1812, but he's killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813 when again General Harrison invades Canada. And at that time, the majority of native resistance to white settlement in the region ends with Tecumseh's death. All right, so the congressional election of 1812 brought a group of new, young Democratic Republicans to Congress, many of them from the frontier states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. And these guys were known as war hawks for their eagerness to go to war with Britain. And they quickly gained significant influence in the House of Representatives. They were led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, two men that will definitely continue to play a prominent role in American history and subsequently this class. We will come back to these gentlemen. So the war hawks claimed that the war with Britain was the only way to defend American honor and gain Canada and destroy the resistance on the frontier. So the British delays in a meeting with the U.S. and demands, the British delays in meeting with the U.S. regarding their demands for neutral rights, combined with political pressures from the war hawks, finally persuade Madison to ask Congress for a declaration of war. Ironically, the British government by this time, in June of 1812, had agreed to actually suspend the naval blockade. Unfortunately, news of that decision reached the White House after Congress had declared war. It's important to remember that this was not a unanimous declaration for war, and this is going to be a trend in U.S. history. We tend to think of 1941 and World War II as basically setting the mold for how the United States decides to go to war and a practically unanimous decision. But in every war that the United States is involved in, there has been a group of people that are very much against this war or that war from the beginning. So as you can see here, this is representing the House of Representatives, and you can see that these these states are not all on the same page in terms of their decision to go to war. Neither Congress or the American people united in the support of war. This decision played out in the presidential election of 1812, in which Democratic strength in the South and West overcame Federalist and anti-war Democratic Republican opposition in the North. Oops, yeah, so here we go. The people who were mainly against the War of 1812 viewed this as Mr. Madison's war, which, by the way, is a sign of disrespect, right? Because Madison is president at that time, and you don't call the president Mr. or Mrs. You call them Madam or Mr. President. So the most outspoken criticism comes from the New England merchants, Federalist politicians, and the Quids, or the old Democratic Republicans. So the New England merchants were opposed after the repeal of the Embargo Act. They were making sizable profits from the European war and viewed impressment really as just a minor inconvenience. Both commercial interests and religious ties to Protestantism made them more sympathetic to the Protestant British than to the Catholic French. Federalist politicians viewed the war as a Democratic Republican scheme to conquer Canada and Florida, with the ultimate aim of increasing Democratic Republican voting strength. And for their part, the Quids, or the old school Democratic Republicans, criticized the war because it violated the classic Democratic Republican commitment to limited federal power and to the maintenance of peace. So we're going to skip on over the key events, remember, of the War of 1812 in this, but that doesn't mean that you don't need to know a little bit about U.S. strategy during that time period. And we're going to skip ahead to the end of the war. By 1814, the British were weary of war. Having fought Napoleon for more than a decade, they now faced the prospect of maintaining the peace in Europe, while at the same time, Madison's government recognized that Americans were going to be unable to win a decisive victory. So American peace commissioners traveled to Ghent, Belgium, to discuss terms of peace with British diplomats. And on Christmas Eve of 1814, an agreement was reached regarding this treaty. And the terms halted fighting, returned all conquered territory to the pre-war owner, and recognized pre-war boundaries between Canada and the United States. You might also note that the United States did not basically get their objectives met in this war. There's no agreement between the U.S. and British that the British were going to stop seizing ships or impressing their sailors. All right, so an important key event that happens during this time period is the New England states threatened to secede from the Union. They bitterly opposed both the war and the Democratic Republican in Washington. And the Hartford Convention was attended by a group of radical Federalists who basically wanted to limit Democratic Republican power by calling for a 2/3 vote from both houses in order to declare war in the future, because that would have made this war illegal. They would not have had enough votes to declare war had they had that happen. But the news of this Hartford Convention comes out around the same time that the Treaty of Ghent is released. And so it really makes the United States thinks that they end up winning the war because of the Battle of New Orleans, even though that happens technically after the Treaty of Ghent. So the United States are feeling pretty good about themselves. Yay, we got the British to surrender because of Jackson and his courage in the Battle of New Orleans, and then you get this news of these Federalists, and they looked basically